It started like any other ordinary day. I had just finished my shift, tired and hoping to get a few quiet hours to myself. The sky was a little overcast, but the streets were calm. I was on my way to visit my cousin for a short talk and to drop off a few papers he had left with me. It wasn't anything serious, just a routine stop in a quiet neighborhood. The kind of neighborhood where everyone seems to know each other, where the lawns are trimmed just right, and where people pretend they're friendlier than they really are. I parked my car neatly along the curb, made sure it wasn't blocking any driveways, and walked into my cousin's house. Now, I wasn't dressed in anything special, just regular jeans, a black t-shirt, and sneakers. Nothing flashy, nothing that made me stand out. But I would come to learn that to some people, your skin tone, the car you drive, or the fact that you don't look like you belong, is enough to make you suspicious. I hadn't been inside more than 30 minutes. I laughed with my cousin, handed him the documents, talked a bit about work, and we shared a small meal. I wasn't even thinking about the car, until I stepped back outside and saw it halfway, lifted off the ground by a tow truck. At first, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My heart jumped. I rushed toward the street, calling out to the man by the truck. "Hey, that's my car. What's going on?" The man looked up from the clipboard in his hands, slightly startled. He paused, but before he could answer, a woman stepped in. She came marching from her front lawn, arms crossed, chin high, eyes squinting at me like she was trying to burn holes through me with just her stare. "You can't park here," she snapped. "This is a residential street. You're blocking the view for people turning out of the drive. It's unsafe." I called the tow company, and they agreed. I looked at the curb. There was no sign, no red paint, no warning. My car wasn't even close to the corner. "I'm not blocking anything," I said calmly. "This isn't even your property." She folded her arms tighter. "I've lived here 22 years. I know what's allowed and what isn't. You're not from here. I saw you walk into that house and you don't live there." That part shocked me. How would she know if I lived there or not? Was she watching me the whole time? I tried to remain calm, not wanting to escalate the situation. "I'm visiting family, and my car is legally parked. You had no right to tow it." She scoffed and turned back to the tow truck driver. "He's getting aggressive now. You saw that, right?" He came rushing out of nowhere and started yelling. The tow truck driver looked uncomfortable, clearly not wanting to be caught in the middle. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I was told the vehicle was unauthorized. But if he's the owner, and there's no signage," she interrupted again, this time pulling out her phone. "I'm calling the police," she said, her voice rising as she started to dial. "There's a strange man threatening me. He's being hostile. I don't feel safe." I couldn't believe what was happening. I hadn't taken a single step toward her. I hadn't raised my voice or made any threats. I was standing still, my arms by my sides, trying to keep calm. But she was already playing the victim, painting a picture that didn't exist. And in situations like this, perception can be more dangerous than truth. I slowly reached into my back pocket. The driver tensed, but I moved slowly and deliberately. I pulled out my wallet, flipped it open, and showed her the inside. There, gleaming under the plastic window, was my federal badge. Homeland Security. Her face changed instantly. Her eyes widened, and her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out at first. The phone was still in her hand, but she didn't press the call button. I held the badge out long enough for both of them to see. "You just tried to have a federal agent's car towed for parking legally." Based on assumptions, the tow truck driver immediately started lowering the car. "Sir, I'm sorry, I didn't know. I'll fix this right away. No charge." Again, "Sorry about the trouble," I nodded to him. "You were doing your job." "It's fine," but she didn't move. She just stood there, frozen, the phone still in her hand. "I had a no," she said finally. "You didn't look like," and then she stopped herself. "Didn't look like what?" I asked, not moving. She fumbled with her words. "I thought, maybe you were doing something suspicious. People come around here all the time," and her voice trailed off. "That's the problem," I said. "You assumed you saw someone you didn't recognize and called a tow truck. And when that wasn't enough, you tried to call the police. You made up a story." She looked down suddenly, interested in the grass at her feet. "I was just trying to keep the neighborhood safe by calling the police on a parked car," I asked. There was nothing more to say. I thanked the tow truck driver again, got into my car, and drove off slowly. But I didn't forget it, because even though I had a badge, that situation could have gone very differently. What if I wasn't with the department? What if I didn't have proof? What if the police showed up and believed her? It stuck with me for days. The way she acted, the way she called me a threat, the way she assumed I didn't belong, and the worst part, she probably forgot all about it within the hour. To her, it was just a misunderstanding. To me, it was a near miss. But the story didn't end there. 2 days later, I got a letter. Hand-delivered, no stamp, no return address, just tucked under my front door. It was from her, Cynthia Haro. That was her name. She wrote a formal apology, said she felt terrible, that she had overreacted, that she was under stress. Said she didn't know I was a federal officer and that she respects law enforcement. But nowhere in that letter did she say she was sorry for assuming I was a threat. Nowhere did she acknowledge that her actions could have gotten someone arrested or, worse. It made me wonder, how many people had she done this to before? How many others had their day ruined, their peace disturbed, or their safety threatened because of her assumptions? I thought about letting it go completely, but something about it felt unfinished. That kind of thinking that fear disguised as neighborhood watch was dangerous. I had seen it too many times before, and if no one ever pushed back, it would never stop. The next morning, I called the homeowners association. I didn't file a complaint, but I asked a question. Does anyone on the block have authority to call for towing on a public street without HOA or city authorization? The woman on the phone was polite but clear. Absolutely not. Only city code enforcement or traffic officers can authorize. That residents can report, but they cannot request tows themselves. That's illegal. Double quotes. Interesting. That gave me an idea. Not for revenge, but for accountability. I printed out a copy of her note and drafted one of my own. Not a threat. Not a warning. Just a request for a neighborhood meeting to discuss protocol when dealing with visitors, parking, and reporting. I sent it to the HOA board. I didn't mention her by name, but I didn't need to. Word travels fast. What I didn't expect, though, was what happened next. A week later, I received another knock at the door. This time, not a letter or an apology, but something that would make this story much more complicated. The knock at the door was calm, not urgent, but something about it made me pause before answering. When I opened it, there stood a man I hadn't seen before. He looked to be in his late 50s, wore a dark gray polo shirt tucked neatly into khakis, and carried a manila envelope in one hand. His face was lined but kind, like someone who had seen a lot but didn't wear it heavily. "Good morning," he said politely. "Are you Mr. James Carter?" "Yes," I answered, cautious. He offered a quick nod. "I'm Henry Strauss, president of the Homeowners Association." "I didn't expect that. I received your letter," he continued, "about the incident on our street last week." I nodded. "Yes, I just wanted to raise awareness about what happened. I wasn't asking for anything drastic." He smiled faintly. "I understand, but I think this is worth more than a passing conversation." He handed me the envelope. Inside was a printed letter from the HOA board, an official invite to their next meeting, along with a note saying they wanted me to share my experience as part of a new discussion on neighborhood behavior and reporting. I didn't plan on speaking at any meetings. I hadn't written my letter to start a movement. But if they were opening the door, I figured it couldn't hurt. The meeting was set for a Friday evening at the community center, clean but simple, building right across from a small park. When I arrived, the parking lot was already half full. A dozen or so chairs were arranged in rows inside, and a long folding table sat at the front, where the board members sat. I recognized Henry right away, but what caught my eye more was that Kern Cynthia was also there, sitting stiffly in the second row, her hands clutched around a notepad. She didn't look at me. When my name was called to speak, I walked to the front slowly, unsure of how to begin. "I'm not here to call anyone out by name," I said. "I'm not here for revenge or punishment. But what happened to me last week shouldn't happen to anyone." The room was silent, listening. I parked legally. I visited family, and I was nearly towed and reported to police based on someone's assumption about who I was or whether I belonged. That's not just unfair, it's dangerous. I could see some heads nodding. Others stayed still. Cynthia stared straight ahead. "I'm a federal agent," I continued, "but that shouldn't be the reason I was spared. What if I wasn't? What if I was just someone visiting a friend? We need to be careful about how we judge people. We need to ask questions before we take action." The rest of the meeting went by quickly. Some residents shared stories, others asked questions about protocol. Henry promised they would issue new neighborhood guidelines about parking and calling services like towing or police. Afterward, as people were packing up, Cynthia finally approached me. She looked different, smaller somehow. Her voice was soft. "Mr. Carter, I just wanted to say thank you for not mentioning my name, for not humiliating me." I studied her for a moment. "That wasn't my goal, I know," she said, "but it still could have gone differently, and I was wrong. I'm trying to unlearn some habits." That caught me off guard. "Habits?" I asked. She sighed. "I grew up around a certain way of thinking. What neighborhoods are supposed to look like. Who fits, who doesn't. It's no excuse, but it's real, and it's hard to face." I nodded. Slowly, acknowledging it is a start. She looked down. "I thought you'd ruin me. Social media, public complaints, maybe even legal action." "I didn't want to ruin you," I said. "I wanted to stop this from happening again." "To anyone?" She gave a small nod, turned, and walked away. I didn't know if that would be the last I'd hear from her, but I was content to let it rest for. Now days passed, then weeks. The neighborhood quieted again. The tension eased. My cousin told me Cynthia had started volunteering at a nearby community center. Whether it was guilt, growth, or something in between, I didn't know. But change, even small, is still change. Then one afternoon, something strange happened. I was walking near that same curb where all of this began when I saw a teenager standing next to a different car, looking frustrated. A woman was yelling at him from her porch. "You can't park there. This isn't your neighborhood." I stopped. It wasn't Cynthia this time. It was someone else. The boy looked confused, hands raised. "I'm just waiting for my uncle. He lives here." I walked up slowly, gave a polite nod to the boy, and turned toward the woman. "Is there a problem here?" I asked. She hesitated. "He's been standing out here for a while." "I just thought you thought wrong," I said. "He's waiting on family. There's nothing illegal about that." She looked flustered but didn't say anything else. The boy gave me a quick thanks and leaned against the car, waiting. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just about one Karen, one incident, or one mistake. It was about a mindset so deep and habitual that kept resurfacing unless challenged. I didn't flash my badge that time. I didn't need to. I had learned at presence.com, and words can be stronger than authority when used right. But even still, I knew I'd keep the badge in my back pocket, not just as protection but as a reminder. A reminder of how quickly situations can change, how fast judgment can become danger, and how important it is to stand still, stand firm, and speak up when it matters. Because the truth is, this story didn't begin with a badge, and it didn't end with a tow truck. It was just the start of something bigger. Weeks passed, and the situation faded into the background, at least for most people. But something inside me had shifted. It wasn't just about being targeted, it was about seeing how easily it could have gone wrong, how fragile the line was between misunderstanding and disaster. I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to do more than just talk about it once at an HOA meeting. One day, I found myself standing in front of a local community mentorship center. It wasn't big, just 2 rooms, a few volunteers, and some donated chairs, but it was where local teens came after school. I had passed it many times, but never gone in. That day, I did. Inside, I met a woman named Loretta. She was in her 60s, sharp-eyed and kind in a no-nonsense way. She ran the place with just a handful of helpers and said most of the kids who came there needed someone to simply listen, someone who wouldn't judge them before they even opened their mouths. I told her briefly about what had happened to me. She nodded. "It's not new," she said, "but when someone like you speaks about it, it reaches further." I offered to volunteer 1 day a week, just an hour, nothing major. She smiled and handed me a sign-up form. The first day I came, I met a boy named Malik, 16, smart, quiet, eyes that had seen more than they should have at that age. We didn't talk much at first, just sat in the same room while he worked on a small robot he was building from recycled parts. I asked questions here and there. He answered with short words, but I kept showing up. After a few weeks, he started to open up. One day, as he tightened a screw on a motor he'd salvaged, he said without looking at me, "You ever had someone just assume you're doing something wrong just by standing somewhere?" I looked at him and said, "Yeah, more than once." He nodded, still not making eye contact. "It happens to me every time I walk home, like I'm suspicious for existing." I didn't respond right away. I just sat beside him. Sometimes silence says more than words. He looked up at me. "You ever been scared? Not of doing anything wrong, but of someone saying you did anyway?" That hit hard. I nodded slowly. "Yeah, Malik, I have." That was the start of something real. Not just between us, but between me and that whole group of kids. They didn't need speeches. They didn't need perfect role models. They needed people who understood, who had lived it, who could show them how to move through a world that was often stacked against them without losing themselves. Meanwhile, back in the neighborhood, things seemed calmer. People waved a little more, looked a little longer, asked fewer suspicious questions. I could tell the board had quietly reinforced new expectations about conduct. Nothing public, nothing dramatic, but enough to shift the air slightly. Then one evening, as I returned home from the center, I saw Cynthia again. She was walking her dog, a small terrier that barked too much for its size. We made eye contact, and I gave a polite nod. To my surprise, she walked over. "Hi again," she said, a little awkward. "Evening," I replied. "I heard you've been volunteering with the Mentorship Center," she said. I nodded. "Just trying to help out where I can." She looked at the ground, then back at me. I've been thinking about that day a lot. Not just what I did, but how quickly I made a judgment. I've always thought of myself as a good person, but good people can still carry bad habits. I didn't say anything. I let her speak. "I signed up to volunteer, too," she added, "once a month, not at the center, but at the local shelter. I don't know if it changes much, but I wanted to start somewhere. Starting somewhere is better than standing still," I said. She looked relieved, like a burden had been lifted. "Thanks, I really do regret that day." I gave a short nod. "Me too, but maybe it happened for a reason." After that, we didn't become friends, but we didn't avoid each other either. We became something else, neighbors, the kind who nodded respectfully, who knew that growth could come from the most uncomfortable moments. And still, the work continued. At the center, Malik's robot finally moved on its own. The kids started asking more questions about careers, about travel, about justice. I didn't always have answers, but I always made sure to listen. One day, Malik handed me a small note. No fancy words. Just a message, scribbled in pencil. Thanks for showing me I'm not crazy, that it's real, and that I can still make it. That note stayed with me. It reminded me of something I used to forget. Stories don't always end with big victories. Sometimes, they end with understanding, with change, with a new direction. But just when I thought the whole situation was behind me, I got a letter. In the mail, this time, official. It was from the city. Apparently, my quiet story shared at the HOA, mentioned by a neighbor, whispered from one person to another, had reached the ears of a city council member. They were starting a local initiative around community accountability, and someone had recommended me to speak at their launch event. I wasn't sure at first. I'm not a speaker, I'm a federal agent. I work behind the scenes. But something told me this moment wasn't about being comfortable. It was about showing people that even quiet moments like a car almost being towed can have loud lessons. At the event, I stood before a small but focused crowd. Policymakers, community leaders, students, elders. I told my story again, about a woman who made a call too fast, about a man who stayed calm instead of reacting in anger, about how both of them changed, not because they were forced to, but because they chose to. When I finished, someone in the back stood up. A young girl, maybe 13. She asked, "Do you think people like her ever really change?" I smiled gently. Sometimes they don't, but sometimes they do. And when they do, it changes more than just them. She nodded and sat down, and that's the thing. We all carry badges. Not physical ones, but inner ones. The badge of kindness, the badge of courage, the badge of awareness. Some wear theirs proudly, others forget they have one at all. But when the moment comes, and you're tested, you find out what kind of badge really defines you. Mine wasn't just issued by the agency. It was earned through patience, restraint, and showing up even when I didn't have to. That's what stayed with me. And that's what I carried forward every day after that. Time has a funny way of healing, but it never fully erases. After that city event, a few more people reached out. A pastor invited me to speak at a youth program. A teacher asked if I'd consider mentoring one of her students who had been unfairly profiled at school. Even a local radio station called, asking if I'd share the story in a short interview. I declined that one, not because I was afraid, but because I wanted the focus to stay off me and on the message. What surprised me most was how often people said the same thing after hearing the story. "I've seen this happen before," or "something like that happened to my friend," or even, "I didn't realize how common it was until now." It made me realize how many stories were buried in silence, held in by fear or shame, or just the feeling that speaking up wouldn't change anything. But it does change something, if not the world, then at least the people around you. One afternoon, while walking near the park, I saw Malik again. He was with a small group of younger boys, showing them how to wire a small circuit. They were all laughing, teasing each other, but also listening closely. He saw me, gave a nod, then kept teaching. That was all I needed. It wasn't about credit. It was about continuity. The story didn't end with me. It kept moving, reshaping lives I'd never meet. Cynthia, the woman who had called the tow truck, had become more involved in the neighborhood too. I heard from my cousin that she started organizing monthly community meet and greet events, mostly for newer families moving into the area. A small gesture, but meaningful. I attended one of them, quietly. I watched her help a family set up a booth, watched her answer questions with patience, watched her listen. She never addressed what happened publicly again. And I never asked her to. Sometimes remorse is best shown through action, not words. We don't always need apologies. We need changes we can see. But not everything was smooth. A few weeks later, someone spray-painted slurs on a wall near the community center. Bold, ugly, unmistakable. It hit everyone hard, especially the kids. Loretta, the center's leader, stood outside, staring at the wall in silence. For the first time, I saw tears in her eyes. I stood beside her, not knowing what to say. She finally whispered, "We teach, we help, we give, and still this." But before nightfall, something amazing happened. Volunteers from all over the neighborhood showed up. People brought paint, rollers, even plants. By sundown, the wall wasn't just cleaned, it was transformed. A mural appeared, of children holding hands, of elders standing tall, of words like hope, respect, and together woven into the background. And right at the bottom corner, someone painted a small badge, not a police badge, not a federal emblem, but a symbol for community. A shield made of hearts, leaves, and light. That mural became a symbol in itself, a message that hate might arrive in the dark, but unity always rises in the morning. I didn't paint any of it, but I stood there the whole time, helping where I could, watch and learning. A few days later, Malik told me one of the younger boys from the center had been inspired by the mural. He started writing poems. Short ones, but powerful. One of them went, "They judged him fast, but he stood slow. He didn't fight, but he let them know that a badge you wear isn't always seen. Sometimes it's patience and staying clean." That little boy was 10, and that poem meant more to me than a dozen public awards. In moments like those, you realize that stories ripple far beyond the people inside them. One act of calm, one choice not to escalate, one decision to speak rather than shout can echo through communities, schools, hearts, and minds. One evening, I received a message from the HOA, not about a complaint or concern, but about a change in policy. They were introducing a community de-escalation workshop for residents, optional, but encouraged. I was asked to be one of the facilitators. Again, I didn't seek it, but I didn't refuse it either. If the moment calls, we answered. At the first workshop, we talked about assumptions, about the stories we tell ourselves when we see someone who looks unfamiliar, acts differently, or simply exists in a space we think they shouldn't. It wasn't accusatory, it was human. Cynthia attended. She didn't speak much, but she listened. And at the end, she came up to me with a short sentence that stayed in my heart. "You gave me a second chance without knowing you were giving it." That night, I went home and sat quietly on the porch. The wind moved slowly. A car passed by. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked once and stopped, and I thought about how all of this had started, with a tow truck and a woman's quick judgment, and yet, here we were, changed, not perfectly, not completely, but changed. That's the power of presence, of not reacting with anger, of not returning heat with fire. In law enforcement, we're taught to read situations fast, to react quickly, but in life, some of the best responses come when we slow everything down, when we breathe, when we listen. People always assume that showing a badge changes everything. And in some ways, it does, but not because of the metal or the authority behind it, because it forces people to reevaluate the story they were writing in their minds. And maybe the real challenge is getting people to do that before they see the badge. The seasons began to shift. The leaves turned golden. Children played outside in jackets instead of t-shirts. The pace of the neighborhood changed to slower, softer. New families moved in. Old fences were repaired. The mural at the community center became a local landmark, a place where people brought their kids to take pictures, to read the words, to learn. I never thought one afternoon of quiet confrontation would echo this far, but maybe that's what makes stories powerful. Not the noise they make, but the paths they quietly opened out at the Mentorship Center. Malik had been accepted into a pre-engineering program for high school students. Loretta called me with the news. "You should have seen his face," she said. "That boy lit up like the sun." When I saw him the next week, I didn't say much, just a high five. He smirked and said, "Guess I'll have to build something big enough for people to finally stop questioning me." I said, "Nah, you build it for yourself. The rest will catch up later." He nodded, and I saw in his eyes what I hadn't seen before, not just hope, but direction. One morning, I passed by the same curb where the entire story had started. The same house, same tree, same driveway. But something was different now. There were chalk drawings on the pavement, hearts, stars, little quotes. A small hand-painted sign on the porch read, "All are welcome." It was Cynthia's house. That struck me more than any apology ever could. But as the weeks passed and things continued to change, something else happened. One night, around 10 p.m., I got a knock on the door. It was rare for someone to come that late, so I looked through the peephole first. It was a young man, maybe early 20s, holding something wrapped in cloth. I opened the door cautiously. "Are you Agent Carter?" he asked. "Who's asking?" "I'm Trevor," he said, unwrapping the cloth. Inside was a worn leather journal. "My uncle said to give this to you." He handed it over and stepped back. I looked at the name embossed on the inside flap. Henry Strauss, the HOA president. I looked up quickly. "Is he okay?" Trevor gave a faint smile. "He passed 2 nights ago, quietly in his sleep, but he left that, said, you'd know what to do with it." It hit me hard. Henry had been one of the few who acted quietly, but stood firmly when it mattered. I sat down that night and read through the journal. It wasn't personal thoughts, it was community notes, meetings, conversations, ideas, concerns, notes about stories people never told out loud. One entry stood out, dated a week after the HOA meeting. "James Carter reminded us who we are supposed to be, not because of his badge, but because of his restraint. This neighborhood needs more people like him, not just to protect us, but to remind us we're better than our worst moments." I closed the journal, held it in my lap, and just sat for a long time. The next morning, I met with Loretta and asked if we could start a small fund in Henry's name. Something simple to help any local kid who wanted to join a science club, a sports team, or any program that needed a fee they couldn't afford. She lit up at the idea. Within a week, we had a name, the Henry Strauss Bridge Fund. Because bridges don't erase the gaps, but they help us cross them. A few months later, something unexpected happened. The department I worked for called and asked if I'd be willing to help lead a new community policing advisory group. not to enforce, but to educate. To talk about de-escalation, to help train other officers on how to listen as much as they look. They said they'd been hearing about the story for a while now, how it had sparked change without anyone getting hurt. I agreed. In the first session, I told the story. From beginning to end, the parked car, the tow truck, the badge, the meeting, the mural, the mentorship. Everything. When I finished, one of the new recruits raised her hand. She was young, maybe 20-3. Sir, she said, do you ever feel like you're carrying too much? That it shouldn't be on you to fix how other people think? I thought for a moment. Sometimes, I said, but if not me then, who? And if not now, then when? That's the thing. This isn't about heroism or perfection or being above anyone else. It's about choosing, in that one defining moment, not to match someone's fear with more fear, but to meet it with patience. That moment when someone tries to tow your car not just physically, but symbolically. When they try to remove your presence, erase your right to belong. You can respond with rage, or you can respond with purpose. I chose the latter. And that made all the difference. To this day, the mural still stands. The center still buzzes with kids. Cynthia still hosts community tea gatherings. Malik is working on a drone prototype. And somewhere in a drawer, I still keep that badge. Not because I need to use it, but because it reminds me of the day someone tried to strip away my dignity, and how I chose not to let them. Because dignity isn't given by a badge. It's carried in how you show up, how you speak when you're silenced. And how you stand when no one expects you to. That's the legacy I now live. Not as an officer, but as a neighbor, a mentor, and just a man who parked his car, waited calmly, and chose not to be pulled away by ignorance.